On June 7th, Armenia goes to the polls for a parliamentary election that could decide not only who governs the country, but where Armenia sits in the world. On one side is Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, the leader of the 2018 Velvet Revolution, who has spent the past few years slowly moving Armenia away from Russia and closer to Europe and the United States. And on the other side is a fragmented opposition, much of which wants to restore closer ties with Moscow and take harder line on Azerbaijan. So in this video, we're going to look at why Armenia's election matters, how the country got here, who's actually running, and whether Pashinyan can survive one of the most geopolitically charged elections Armenia has ever held. Before we start, my name is Nick, and this is This Week in Elections. To understand this election, you need to know a bit about Armenia's recent history. Back in 2018, Nikol Pashinyan came into power after Armenia's Velvet Revolution, a wave of pro-democracy protests that forced out the country's old political establishment. He then won a huge victory in the 2018 election and, despite Armenia's defeat in the 2020 war with Azerbaijan, won again in 2021. In that election, Pashinyan's Civil Contract Party won almost 54% of the vote and 71 seats, giving him a clear majority in parliament. At the time, that was pretty surprising. Armenia had just lost a devastating war over Nagorno-Karabakh, a majority Armenian region internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but controlled for decades by Armenian forces. After the 2020 defeat, Pashinyan faced mass protests and calls to resign, but in the 2021 snap election, voters essentially decided that despite the war, they did not want the old guard back in power. However, things changed again in 2023 when Azerbaijan retook full control of Nagorno-Karabakh, leading to the mass flight of ethnic Armenians from the region. For many Armenians, that was a national trauma, and it also shattered one of the central assumptions of Armenia's foreign policy, which is that Russia would protect Armenia when it really mattered. For decades, Armenia had been one of Russia's closest allies in the South Caucasus. It hosted a Russian military base, belonged to Russia-led CSTO security alliance, and was deeply tied into Russia's economic orbit. But after Moscow failed to meaningfully intervene during Armenia's clashes with Azerbaijan, Pashinyan began openly questioning the value of that relationship. Since then, Armenia has frozen its participation in the CSTO, deepened cooperation with the EU, expanded ties with Washington, and pursued a peace deal with Azerbaijan. Earlier this year, Yerevan hosted the first ever EU-Armenia summit, which was a pretty clear sign of where Pashinyan wants to take the country. Unsurprisingly, Moscow is not thrilled. In the run-up to this election, Russia has ramped up pressure on Armenia. Reuters reports that Moscow has threatened economic retaliation, including restrictions on Armenian exports and warnings over access to discounted Russian oil, gas, and diamonds. Russia has also warned that Armenia's EU ambitions may not be compatible with its membership in the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. And that brings us to the election itself. Armenia's National Assembly has at least 101 seats, elected by proportional representation. Parties need to pass a threshold to enter parliament, and if no government can be formed after the first round, Armenia's system allows for a second round between the top two parties. The winner of that second round then receives enough extra seats to secure a governing majority. So this is not just a question of who comes first. Pashinyan's Civil Contract Party is expected to finish in first place, but the real question is whether it can win enough seats to govern comfortably, or whether Armenia ends up in another fragmented parliament, coalition negotiations, or even a second round. According to one recent IRI poll, Civil Contract is polling at around 32%, with Samvel Karapetyan's Strong Armenia Alliance in second on around 8%, while the Armenia Alliance and Prosperous Armenia are further behind. But the same polling also showed a large number of undecided voters or people refusing to answer, which makes the race harder to predict. The main opposition forces are split across several parties. There is the Armenia Alliance, led by former President Robert Kocharan, who is seen as much more pro-Russian and closely associated with Armenia's old political elite. There's Prosperous Armenia, led by businessman Gagik Sarkyan, which has traditionally leaned towards closer ties with Russia. Then there's Strong Armenia, linked to Russian-Armenian billionaire Samvel Karapetyan, which has become one of the most closely watched opposition forces in this race. The problem for the opposition is that it's divided. No single anti-Pashinyan force appears strong enough on its own to overtake Civil Contract. But if enough opposition parties enter parliament, that could still make it much harder for Pashinyan to govern. And this is where Russia becomes a central part of the story. Reuters also reported, citing Western intelligence officials, that Russia has been running covert efforts to undermine Pashinyan and support more pro Russian candidates. These alleged efforts include disinformation campaigns, fake websites, and even plans to transport Russian Armenian voters into Armenia to influence the election. Moscow denies interfering, but the allegations have made this campaign even more tense. And this matters because Armenia is not just deciding whether Pashinyan gets another term, it is deciding whether the country continues its current path, which is away from Russia, towards the EU and the United States, and towards a peace agreement with Azerbaijan. Pashinyan's argument is basically that Armenia needs to accept geopolitical reality. That means recognizing Armenia's internationally accepted borders, making peace with Azerbaijan, opening transport links, and reducing dependence on Moscow. His opponents argue the opposite. They say Pashinyan has weakened Armenia, abandoned Nagorno-Karabakh, and gambled the country's security on Western partners who may not actually protect it in a crisis. And honestly, that argument still has some political power. Because even though Russia is much less popular in Armenia than it used to be, Armenia can't just ignore Moscow. Russia is still economically important. Many Armenians live and work in Russia, and Russia still has a military presence in the country. Not to mention, Armenia is surrounded by very difficult neighbors, including Azerbaijan, but also Turkey, Georgia, and Iran. So Pashinyan is trying to do something extremely tricky, which is move Armenia westward without provoking Russia so much that it creates an even bigger crisis. And the election will also affect the peace protest with Azerbaijan. The peace deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan appears closer than it has been for years, but it remains politically explosive. One major issue is a transport route that would connect Azerbaijan to its exclave of Nakhchivan through southern Armenia. Supporters argue this could open Armenia's borders and transform the regional economy. Critics fear it could weaken Armenian sovereignty or give Azerbaijan too much leverage. For Pashinyan, winning the election would give him a mandate to keep negotiating, but if he wins without a strong majority or if the opposition performs better than expected, the peace process could slow down or become much harder to finalize. So there's basically three possible outcomes. The first is that civil contract wins clearly, and Pashinyan stays in power with enough support to keep pushing its foreign policy agenda. That would probably mean deeper EU ties, continued distance from Russia, and more momentum behind a peace deal with Azerbaijan. The second is that civil contract comes first, but falls short of a strong governing position. That would mean coalition talks, a weaker government, or possibly even a second round. This would not necessarily remove Pashinyan from power, but it would make him much more vulnerable. The third is that opposition performs better than expected. This is less likely based on most polling, but if it happens, Armenia could enter a much more unstable period, with pressure to restore ties to Moscow, slow the EU track, and take a tougher line on Azerbaijan. International observers will be watching closely. The OSCE's election observation body has deployed a mission for the June 7th election, meaning the conduct of the election itself will be under strict scrutiny, but ultimately Armenia is not voting on EU membership directly, it is not voting on Russia directly, and is not voting on a peace deal directly. But in practice, all of those issues are on the ballot. If Pashinyan wins, Armenia will probably continue its slow but dramatic pivot away from Russia and towards the West. If he is weakened, the pivot could stall. And if the pro-Russian opposition does better than expected, Armenia can be pulled back towards the old security order it has spent the last few years trying to escape. So Armenia's election may look like a small parliamentary vote in a country of just a few million, but the stakes are much bigger. This is a vote about war and peace. It's a vote about Russia and Europe. And it's a vote of whether Armenia's future lies in the old world of post-Soviet alliances or in a new, riskier, but potentially more independent path. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment what your thoughts are on this election and what elections you want me to cover in the future. Have a good one.